December 17, 1944, 6:30 a.m. The battlefield on the outskirts of Bastogne, in the depths of the Ardennes forest, Belgium. Gil E, a mechanic of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division of the U.S. Army, huddled in a bunker behind the side of an M4 Sherman tank, his hands clutching a greasy wrench tightly, his eyes fixed on the German armored cluster 100 meters ahead. In the bitter cold of -15 degrees Celsius, artillery fire tore through the morning mist, and the roar of tank tracks crushing frozen soil shook the ground slightly. The U.S. defensive line had already developed multiple gaps under the fierce German assault, and the armored detachment he belonged to was trapped in a desperate situation of encirclement on 3 sides. "Left side! Tiger! Evade!" A hoarse roar came from the radio. Before the words faded away, a dazzling orange-red muzzle flash streaked from the German position, and a Sherman tank not far from Sill was hit in the turret instantly. The ear-piercing sound of metal tearing echoed across the battlefield. The turret hatch was blown off by the blast wave, and the smoking wreckage was soon engulfed in flames. Only one of the 3 crew members inside struggled to climb out, but as soon as he rolled into the snow, he was cut down by German machine gun fire, his body twitching a few times before falling still. Sill instinctively shrank his body. Snow on the frozen ground was kicked up by the muzzle blast and fluttered down onto his icy steel helmet. He glanced down at his hands, which were covered not only in oil, but also in antifreeze splashed during the tank repair that morning. His fingertips were already numb with cold, but he had no time to rub them warm. Instead, he stared intently at the newly emerged German tanks on the battlefield. These were the German Tiger heavy tanks, whose thick armor and 88mm guns were almost overwhelmingly superior to the U.S. Sherman tanks. The 37th Tank Battalion, to which Sill belonged, was part of General Patton's 4th Armored Division. Their mission this time was to reinforce the besieged defenders of Bastogne and consolidate the U.S. defensive line in the Ardennes region. However, the German Operation Watch on the Rhine had come as a complete surprise. In the early hours of December the 16th, hundreds of thousands of German troops launched a surprise attack on the weakly defended U.S. positions in the Ardennes under the cover of intensive artillery fire, catching the Americans off guard. In just one day, the Germans broke through the U.S. forward defenses, advancing more than 20 kilometers deep, splitting and encircling several U.S. units, including the detachment Sill was in. At this point, of the 12 Sherman tanks originally assigned to the detachment, 7 had been destroyed or damaged in the overnight fierce fighting, and the remaining 5 were mostly plagued by mechanical failures. Some had their tracks broken by shrapnel, some had engines that failed to start properly in the low temperatures, and others had malfunctioning gun-firing mechanisms. On the German side, however, directly facing Sill's position alone, they had deployed at least an armored battalion consisting of 12 Tiger heavy tanks, 20 Panzer, 4 medium tanks, accompanied by infantry and self-propelled artillery, holding an absolute advantage in both manpower and equipment. "Sill, hurry up and check the engine of tank number 3. It won't start." Sergeant John Murphy crawled into Sill's bunker and shouted loudly. Murphy's face was smudged with soot and dirt. His steel helmet bore a shrapnel scratch, and his voice was hoarse from hours of shouting. Without hesitation, Sill grabbed his toolkit and followed Murphy toward tank number 3. Above the battlefield, German bombers still circled, and the sound of falling bombs exploded one after another, with shrapnel whistling through every corner of the battlefield. The 2 men ran bent over between bunkers, occasionally having to dodge German machine gun fire. Upon reaching tank number 3, Sill immediately opened the engine compartment cover. A wave of hot air mixed with gasoline and engine oil rushed out, only to be quickly scattered by the biting cold wind. He shone a flashlight inside the engine compartment, carefully inspecting every component: spark plugs, fuel pumps, oil lines. After a quick check, he discovered that the fuel line was clogged by ice due to the low temperature, preventing fuel from being supplied to the engine and causing it to fail to start. "The fuel line is frozen. We need a blowtorch to thaw it," Sill shouted back at Murphy. Murphy nodded and immediately turned to find a blowtorch. Sill stayed behind, continuing to inspect other parts of the engine to ensure it would run properly after thawing. Just then, a sudden clatter of tank tracks approached. Sill looked up and saw a German Panzer IV tank heading straight for tank number 3, less than 500 meters away. "Oh no, a German tank is coming!" Sill yelled, quickly stepping back from the engine compartment cover and pulling Murphy, who had just returned with the blowtorch, to hide on the other side of the tank. The German tank's gun was already aimed at tank number 3, and Sill could even see the gunner on the German turret adjusting the sight. His heart was in his throat. If tank number 3 was hit, not only would the tank be completely destroyed, but he and Murphy would also be killed on the spot. At this critical moment, an American Sherman tank suddenly charged out of the woods to the side and fired a shot at the German Panzer IV. The shell hit the side armor of the Panzer IV. Though it failed to penetrate, it still brought the German tank's advance to a halt. The German tank crew immediately rotated the turret, preparing to return fire at the American Sherman. Taking advantage of this gap, Sill said to Murphy, "Cover me. I need to thaw the fuel line quickly." Murphy nodded, picked up his M1 Garand rifle, and kept a wary eye on the German tank. Sill immediately lit the blowtorch, adjusted the flame size, and began heating the frozen fuel line. The blowtorch flame flickered in the cold wind, making a whooshing sound. Sill's hands felt a trace of warmth from the flame, but his attention was entirely focused on the fuel line, daring not to be distracted for a moment. He knew that every second counted. Only by getting tank number 3 started as soon as possible could they boost the unit's combat effectiveness and have a chance to break through the German encirclement. However, things did not go smoothly. Just as the fuel line was about to thaw, the German Panzer IV had finished rotating its turret and fired a shot at the American Sherman. The shell hit the junction of the Sherman's turret directly, blowing the turret clean off and rendering the tank combat ineffective. Seeing this, the German tank crew immediately turned the gun barrel and aimed at tank number 3 once again. By this time, Sill had already thawed the fuel line. He jumped into tank number 3's driver's cabin and tried to start the engine. Vroom! Vroom! The engine emitted a low rumble, but it ran unsteadily due to the low temperature. Sill kept adjusting the throttle, trying to bring the engine up to normal speed. Murphy, meanwhile, fired continuously outside the tank to draw the Germans' attention, but his rifle was powerless against the German tank's armor, serving only as a minor distraction. The German tank's gun was fully aimed, and the muzzle flame was about to erupt again. Cold sweat broke out on Sill's forehead as he stared fixedly at the engine dashboard, silently urging, "Faster, please, faster." Finally, the engine's speed stabilized. Sill shouted loudly, "It started! Get in quickly!" Upon hearing the shout, Murphy immediately dropped his rifle and jumped into tank number 3's turret. Sill slammed on the accelerator, and tank number 3 slowly moved forward, heading toward the woods to the side. Just as they pulled away, the German shell landed exactly where tank number 3 was. 3 had been parked, kicking up a huge cloud of frozen soil and snow. Sill drove tank number 3 through the woods, evading German artillery attacks. He glanced back at the battlefield and saw that the U.S. defensive line was still being breached by the Germans. More Sherman tanks were destroyed, and soldiers fought desperately in the snow, suffering heavy casualties. At this moment, the detachment commander issued an order over the radio. "All operational tanks immediately converge at the rear assembly point. We need to reorganize our defensive line." Sill drove tank number 3 toward the assembly point. Along the way, he saw more destroyed American equipment, tank wrecks, jeeps, artillery pieces, and the bodies of soldiers lying in the snow. Some bodies were already stiff with cold, their faces still contorted with the pain of their final moments. A heavy weight settled in Sill's heart. He knew that the unit's situation was extremely dire, and the remaining combat strength was almost depleted. If they couldn't repair the damaged tanks soon, they would have no way to resist the next German attack, and might even be completely annihilated. Upon reaching the assembly point, Sill immediately jumped out of the tank and began counting the damaged tanks on site. After tallying them up, besides tank number 3, which he had just repaired, there were 5 more damaged Sherman tanks, 2 with broken tracks, 1 with a damaged engine, 1 with a faulty gun, and 1 with a jammed turret traversing mechanism. At this point, only Sill and 2 other soldiers remained as mechanics in the detachment, one of whom was slightly wounded and unable to perform strenuous repair work. Worse still, supplies for repairs were extremely scarce. There was only 1 spare track, insufficient engine parts, very little fuel and oil left, and even basic tools were lost in the fierce fighting. "Sil, what do we do now? With just the two of us and so few supplies, we can never fix all these tanks," said Tom Wilson, the injured mechanic, whose arm was cut by shrapnel and whose bandage was still oozing blood. Sil didn't speak, but walked over to each damaged tank, carefully inspecting the faults, his mind racing to formulate repair plans. He knew that giving up now would mean total defeat. The defenders of Bastogne were still waiting for reinforcements, and they couldn't fall here. He glanced at the demoralized soldiers in the assembly point, then at the battlefield where artillery fire continued to roar in the distance, took a deep breath, and said to Wilson and the other mechanic, "No matter what, we have to try. Fix one tank if we can. Every extra tank means one more chance of victory." Just as Sil resolved to repair the tanks, a new German offensive began. Intensive artillery fire rained down on the assembly point, and bombs exploded within the perimeter, sending up clouds of smoke and dust. The soldiers immediately manned their battle stations, returning fire at the Germans with tanks and artillery. Sil and the two mechanics took cover under the tanks, continuing to inspect the tanks' malfunctions. The sound of artillery fire, explosions, and machine gun fire merged into a brutal symphony of war. Sil's ears were filled with the screams of wounded and dying soldiers, but he forced himself to suppress his grief, focusing solely on the repair work before him. He knew that only by fixing the tanks as quickly as possible could he reduce further casualties and have a chance to repel the German attack. At this point, the battlefield situation grew even more critical. German armored forces had broken through the U.S. outer defensive line and were drawing closer to the assembly point. The remaining U.S. tanks fought valiantly, but against the numerically superior German forces, they were clearly struggling. Sil knew that time was running out. If they couldn't repair at least two tanks in a short time, the assembly point would be overrun and everyone would be doomed. He quickly devised a repair plan. First, fix the two tanks with broken tracks, as track repairs were relatively simple and required less time. Next, repair the tank with the damaged engine and the one with the faulty gun. And finally, fix the tank with the jammed turret mechanism. He split Wilson and the other mechanic into two groups. Wilson would repair one of the track-damaged tanks with assistance, while Sil himself would repair the other track-damaged tank and also oversee fault checks on the remaining tanks. Sil picked up his wrench, crawled under one of the track-damaged tanks, and began removing the damaged track components. The icy metal dug into his knees, and the cold wind seeped under the tank, making him shiver violently. But he paid it no mind. His hands moved swiftly and precisely, dismantling, cleaning, installing, every motion executed with speed and accuracy. He knew that every second saved was one more second of hope. Just as he was about to finish installing the track, a shell landed less than 10 meters away. The powerful blast wave knocked him to the ground, scattering his tools everywhere. He struggled to his feet, his body aching all over, but he had no time to check for injuries. He immediately picked up his tools and resumed their repair work. There was only one thought in his mind. He must fix the tanks quickly and repel the Germans. The battlefield situation continued to deteriorate. U.S. casualties mounted and two more tanks were damaged by German fire. As Sil watched the scene unfold, his resolve only grew stronger. He knew that as a mechanic, even though he couldn't charge headlong into battle like the frontline soldiers, his work was just as important. Every tank he repaired could provide powerful fire support to the frontline troops and contribute to the unit's victory. He took a deep breath, picked up his tools again, and threw himself back into the intense repair work. By this time, the sky was gradually brightening, and the morning mist slowly dissipated, but the smoke of battle hung thicker than ever. Sil didn't know how much longer he could hold on, or if he would ultimately succeed in repairing the tanks, but he knew he had to keep going until the very end. Just as Sil was about to finish repairing the first track-damaged tank, he suddenly heard a familiar roar, the sound of U.S. fighter planes. He looked up and saw several U.S. P-47 Thunderbolts streaking across the sky, launching an attack on the German positions. The fighter planes' cannons strafed German tanks and infantry, and bombs fell on the German line, sending up flames and smoke. The German offensive rhythm was disrupted, and the pressure on the front lines was temporarily relieved. Sill's heart leaped with joy. This was their chance. He immediately accelerated his repair work, and finally, under the cover of the fighter planes, he successfully fixed the first track-damaged tank. He jumped into the driver's cabin, started the engine, and the tank moved smoothly forward. He drove the tank toward the German lines, joining the counterattack. Watching the tank he had repaired charge across the battlefield, a surge of pride welled up in Sill's heart. He knew that this was only the beginning. There were more tanks to repair, and more arduous tasks awaiting him. At this point, the German offensive was temporarily halted by the U.S. fighter attack, but Sill knew clearly that this was only temporary. The Germans would soon organize a new assault. He had to repair more tanks quickly to consolidate the defensive line and buy time for the arrival of reinforcements. He immediately returned to the assembly point and continued repairing the other track-damaged tank. Wilson and the other mechanic also worked diligently. Progress was slow, but they did not give up. Artillery fire continued to rage on the battlefield, and bullets still whistled through the air. But Sill and his comrades, with their own hands, forged hope from the jaws of despair. Their repair work was not only about fixing tanks, it was about boosting the unit's morale and upholding the belief in victory. Everyone waited, hoping that Sill would work a miracle, that the repaired tanks would lead them to break through the encirclement and march toward victory. To understand the desperate situation Sill was in, we must look back at the strategic ambitions behind the brutal confrontation later known as the Battle of the Bulge, in which the Germans threw their last reserves into a desperate gamble and the U.S. military's initial passive position. By 1944, the Allies had successfully landed in Normandy and were gradually advancing toward the German homeland. The writing was on the wall for Nazi Germany, but Hitler refused to surrender. To turn the tide of the war, he devised the secret counter-offensive codenamed Operation Watch on the Rhine. Its core objective was to concentrate superior forces, break through the weakly defended U.S. positions in the Ardennes, drive straight to the Belgian port of Antwerp, split the Allied northern and southern groups, and force the Allies to negotiate a truce on German terms. To achieve this goal, the Germans made meticulous pre-war preparations and implemented strict security measures. Hitler personally oversaw every detail of the battle plan, ordering all units to maintain radio silence during their concentration, conduct all movements at night, and use deceptive troop deployments to confuse Allied intelligence agencies. The Germans massed elite forces, including the 2nd SS Panzer Division and the 6th Panzer Army, totaling approximately 25 divisions, 10 of which were armored divisions, with a strength of over 250,000 troops. They were equipped with around 600 tanks and self-propelled guns, and nearly 2,000 artillery pieces and mortars. Most of these units were well-rested and replenished elite troops with high morale and sophisticated equipment. In particular, the Tiger and Panther heavy tanks held a clear advantage over U.S. Sherman tanks in terms of armor protection and firepower. In stark contrast to the Germans' meticulous planning, the U.S. defenses in the Ardennes had severe flaws. At this time, the U.S. High Command widely believed that the Germans were no longer capable of launching large-scale offensives and regarded the Ardennes as a quiet sector. As a result, they deployed relatively weak forces there, mostly units that had just experienced fierce fighting and were resting and replenishing, or inexperienced rookie units. The U.S. forces responsible for defending the Ardennes mainly consisted of elements of the 1st Army and the 8th Army, totaling about 8 divisions with a strength of less than 100,000 troops and around 400 tanks. The number of artillery pieces was also far less than that of the Germans. More crucially, U.S. intelligence agencies failed to detect the large-scale German concentration in a timely manner, remained completely unaware of the German counteroffensive intentions, and frontline units were generally unprepared. At 5:30 a.m. on the morning of December 16, 1944, the German Operation Watch on the Rhine officially began. Intensive artillery fire blanketed U.S. forward positions for 90 minutes, destroying a large number of U.S. defensive fortifications, communication facilities, and artillery positions. After the artillery barrage, German armored forces and infantry launched a fierce assault on U.S. lines under the cover of dense fog. Caught completely off guard, the U.S. forward positions were quickly overrun, and the troops descended into chaos. Taking advantage of the gaps in the U.S. defenses, the Germans advanced rapidly into the depth of the Allied lines, splitting and encircling several U.S. divisions, including the 101st Airborne Division stationed in Bastogne. Bastogne was a vital transportation hub in the Ardennes, controlling multiple highways and railways. If the Germans captured Bastogne, they could further expand their gains and cut off Allied supply lines. The 4th Armored Division, to which Sill belonged, was part of General Patton's Third Army and was stationed in eastern France, responsible for southern front defense. When the Germans launched their surprise attack in the Ardennes, the U.S. High Command urgently adjusted its deployments, ordering the 4th Armored Division to rush to reinforce Bastogne, break through the German encirclement, and deliver supplies and reinforcements to the besieged 101st Airborne Division. This was an extremely arduous task, as the Germans had seized control of several key highways leading to Bastogne during their advance, and deployed large numbers of armored units and infantry to block any relief efforts. The 37th Tank Battalion, to which Sill belonged, was one of the vanguard units of the 4th Armored Division, tasked with spearheading the breakthrough of German interception lines and opening the route to Bastogne. At noon on December 16th, Sill's detachment received orders to assemble urgently and march toward Bastogne. At this time, light rain fell from the sky, and the roads were muddy and slippery, creating great difficulties for tank movement. As the detachment's mechanic, Sill sat in the co-driver's seat of a Sherman tank, responsible for inspecting the tank's mechanical condition along the way and handling various malfunctions promptly. He clearly remembered that when they set out, all 12 Sherman tanks of the detachment were in good combat condition. Although the soldiers were somewhat surprised by the sudden emergency mission, their morale remained high, and they all hoped to reach Bastogne as soon as possible to complete the reinforcement task. However, the detachment's advance was fraught with difficulties. Shortly after entering the Ardennes forest area, they encountered German vanguard forces. German infantry ambushed them from the woods on both sides of the road, attacking U.S. tanks with rocket launchers and anti-tank guns. Sill's tank platoon led the way, and soon one Sherman tank was hit in the side armor by a German rocket launcher, losing power instantly. The crew was forced to abandon the vehicle and escape. Sill immediately jumped out of his own tank, braved German fire, and ran to inspect the damaged tank. After checking, he found that the tank's engine was destroyed beyond repair and had to be abandoned. This was the first tank lost by the detachment, and it made everyone realize that the danger of this reinforcement mission was far greater than expected. As the detachment pushed deeper into enemy territory, the German resistance intensified. German armored units began to appear, engaging U.S. tanks in fierce exchanges of fire. In one encounter, Sill's detachment clashed head-on with a German tank platoon, and both sides immediately opened fire. Although the German Panzer IV tanks were slightly inferior to the Tiger tanks in terms of firepower and armor, they still held a certain advantage over the Sherman tanks. During the battle, the detachment lost 2 more Sherman tanks to German fire. One tank's turret was directly penetrated, killing all crew members inside. In the lull between battles, Sill quickly inspected the damaged tanks and found that one tank's gun-firing mechanism was damaged by shrapnel, while the other's track was broken. He immediately organized his comrades to carry out repairs, but due to the harsh battlefield environment and constant German fire harassment, the repair work progressed slowly. By the evening of December 16, the sky gradually darkened and the temperature dropped sharply, from 5 degrees Celsius during the day to minus 10 degrees Celsius at night. While advancing, Sill's detachment encountered a large-scale German interception force, and fierce night fighting erupted between the two sides. Taking advantage of the cover of night, the Germans continuously launched surprise attacks on U.S. positions, and U.S. tanks and infantry could only fight back relying on flares and tank searchlights. During the battle, the detachment's communication facilities were destroyed by the Germans, cutting off contact with the division headquarters, leaving them to fight on their own. At this point, the detachment had already lost 5 tanks, and most of the remaining 7 were plagued by mechanical failures. The soldiers also suffered varying degrees of casualties and fatigue. In the early hours of December 17, after a night of fierce fighting, Sill's detachment was forced to retreat to a forest on the outskirts of Bastogne, attempting to reorganize their defensive line. However, the Germans pursued relentlessly, quickly encircling the detachment on 3 sides. At this point, the detachment commander realized that continuing to advance toward Bastogne was impossible. The top priority was to break through the German encirclement and rejoin the main force. But with the Germans holding an absolute advantage in both manpower and equipment, breaking out was extremely difficult. Sill looked at his exhausted comrades and the heavily damaged tanks around him, anxiety weighing heavily on his heart. He knew that the fate of the detachment now largely depended on whether these tanks could be restored to combat readiness. Just as the detachment was trapped in a desperate situation, a new German offensive began. This was the tense battlefield scenario Sill found himself in at the start of this story. Intense German artillery fire rained down on the detachment's positions, and tanks and infantry launched a fierce assault on U.S. lines under the cover of artillery. Sill's detachment could only rely on the remaining tanks and infantry to put up a tenacious resistance, but casualties continued to mount, and more tanks were destroyed. By 6:30 on the morning of December the 17th, of the 12 tanks originally assigned to the detachment, 7 had been destroyed or damaged, and most of the remaining 5 had mechanical failures. The detachment's combat effectiveness was nearly halved. At this time, Sill also clearly understood that the reason the Germans were able to make such significant gains in a short period was not only due to their numerical and equipment advantages, but also because they exploited the U.S. military's complacency and defensive vulnerabilities. U.S. defensive fortifications in the Ardennes were simple, troop deployments were scattered, and effective coordinated operations were lacking. Faced with the sudden German attack, they were unable to organize an effective resistance in a timely manner. In addition, the bitter cold weather caused numerous mechanical failures in tanks and affected the combat effectiveness of soldiers. In contrast, the Germans made full use of natural conditions, such as dense fog and night, to advance covertly and break through quickly, inflicting heavy losses on the U.S. military. As a vanguard unit of the 4th Armored Division, the 37th Tank Battalion was originally tasked with the important mission of reinforcing Bastogne. However, due to the sudden German attack and stubborn resistance, they not only failed to complete their mission, but also became trapped. At this point, communication between the battalion headquarters and each detachment had been severed, and they could not receive support from the main force, leaving them to rely on their own strength to break out of the encirclement. Sill watched the German bombers circling overhead, listening to the continuous sound of artillery fire and explosions in the distance, and knew clearly that the upcoming battles would be even more brutal. As one of the few remaining mechanics in the detachment, he bore a heavy responsibility on his shoulders. He had to repair the damaged tanks as quickly as possible to restore the detachment's combat effectiveness, giving his comrades a chance to break through the German encirclement and rejoin the main force. While Sill focused on repairing the tanks, he was unaware that the overall situation in the Ardennes was deteriorating rapidly in the U.S. military's favor. After breaking through the U.S. forward defenses, the Germans continued to advance into the depth of Allied lines, successively encircling several U.S. units and capturing a large number of towns and villages. It was only then that the Allied High Command realized the German counteroffensive was far more powerful than expected. They urgently adjusted their deployments, ordering General Patton's 3rd Army and General Montgomery's 21st Army Group to launch counterattacks from the north and south toward the Ardennes, attempting to cut off German supply lines and encircle the German counteroffensive forces. However, due to the rapid German advance, the Allied counterattack deployments required time, and effective support could not be provided to the besieged U.S. units in the short term. For Sill's detachment, this meant they had to hold out on their own without external assistance. At this time, the detachment commander had readjusted the battle plan, deciding to contract the defensive line, concentrate the remaining manpower and equipment, hold the existing positions, and wait for the arrival of Allied counterattack forces. To hold their positions, they had to rely on the fire support of tanks, making Sill's repair work all the more critical. He knew that every tank he repaired could add strength to the defense of the position and buy more time for his comrades. He took a deep breath, picked up his tools again, and threw himself back into the intense repair work. Artillery fire continued to rage on the battlefield, and the cold wind still howled, but his heart was filled with unwavering faith. He believed that as long as he did not give up, as long as his comrades did not give up, they would surely wait for the arrival of reinforcements and break through the desperate situation before them. At 9:15 on the morning of December 17, 1944, the cover provided by U.S. fighter planes came to an end, and the German offensive resumed. Inside the assembly point, Sill had just completed the repair and testing of the second track-damaged tank. The roar of the engine starting mingled with the sound of German shells exploding. He jumped out of the tank, too busy to wipe the sweat from his forehead. Despite the temperature remaining at -15 degrees Celsius, the intense repair work had left him sweating profusely. He immediately rushed toward the tank with the damaged engine. Sherman Tank Number 7. This tank had been hit in the engine compartment by a German anti-tank gun during the night fighting, leaving a 15-centimeter diameter hole in the side of the compartment. The oil line was completely severed, and parts of the cylinder block were also damaged. Sill opened the engine compartment cover, and a strong smell of engine oil rushed to his nostrils. He shone a flashlight inside the compartment, quickly assessing the extent of the damage. The oil pump was intact, but the pipeline connecting the oil pump to the cylinder block was completely destroyed. The bullet hole in the cylinder block caused oil to leak out uncontrollably. To get the engine running again, they had to first repair the bullet hole and replace the damaged pipeline. However, the problem was that there were no spare oil pipelines in the repair supplies, nor were there any specialized cylinder block repair materials. No pipelines, we'll find alternatives. No repair materials, we'll make do with what we have. Sill gritted his teeth and shouted to Wilson beside him. Go collect parts from the destroyed tank wrecks. See if you can find any usable pipelines or similar metal tubes, and grab some sealant and iron wire. Hurry. Wilson immediately obeyed the order, braving German artillery fire to rush to the tank wreckage area on the edge of the battlefield. Sill stayed by tank number 7, starting to clean up the damaged components and residual engine oil inside the engine compartment. He used a wrench to remove the fragments of the damaged pipeline and wiped the oil stains and dust off the surface of the cylinder block with a rag to better observe the exact location and shape of the bullet hole. At this time, German machine gun bullets continuously whizzed over his head, and the swish-swish sound was endless. A shell landed less than 20 meters away, shaking the engine compartment cover violently and scattering the parts inside everywhere. Sill instinctively threw himself beside the engine compartment, and as soon as the shock wave passed, he immediately got up and continued working. He knew that every minute and every second was precious. The German offensive was growing more intense by the minute, and the assembly point's defensive line was already showing signs of collapsing. Here it is necessary to insert a technical analysis of the M4 Sherman tank engine. The Sherman tank that Sill was repairing was equipped with a Wright R975 radial engine, with a displacement of 15.9 liters and a maximum power output of 350 horsepower. It ran on gasoline and drove the tank tracks through a drive shaft. The advantage of this engine was its relatively simple structure, ease of maintenance, and high interchangeability of parts. This was an important foundation that allowed Sill to carry out repairs in the battlefield environment. However, it also had obvious disadvantages. Gasoline was highly flammable and explosive. The engine compartment had weak armor protection and was easily damaged by anti-tank weapons. At the same time, in the bitter cold of -15 degrees Celsius, the engine oil's viscosity increased significantly, making starting more difficult, and the pipelines were prone to brittleness and fracture in low temperatures. This was also an important technical challenge that Sill had to overcome in this repair work. About 20 minutes later, Wilson returned covered in dust and oil, clutching a section of metal pipeline salvaged from a destroyed German Panzer IV tank, along with half a tube of sealant and a bundle of thick iron wire. Sill, this is the only usable piece, a cooling pipe from a German tank. The diameter is roughly the same as our oil pipeline, but the material is thinner. Wilson panted heavily. Sill took the metal pipeline and measured its diameter with a ruler. It was indeed basically matching the oil pipeline. Although the material was thinner and might not withstand high pressure, it would have to suffice in an emergency. We'll use this, Sill decided immediately. Help me secure the pipeline, and I'll repair the bullet hole in the cylinder block. Sill first cut some metal fragments into patches that matched the shape of the bullet hole in the cylinder block, then applied sealant around the patches and the bullet hole, pressing the patches tightly against the hole. He then wrapped iron wire around the patches and the cylinder block to secure them firmly, ensuring the sealant could fully do its job. This process required extreme patience and meticulousness. The sealant had to be applied evenly, and the iron wire had to be wrapped with just the right amount of force, firm enough to hold the patches in place, but not so tight that it damaged other parts of the cylinder block. Sill's hands were covered in cuts and oil stains from hours of work, and the cold weather made the wounds throb with pain. But he did not allow himself to be distracted for a moment, executing every movement with precision and steadiness. After repairing the bullet hole in the cylinder block, Sill began connecting the replacement metal pipeline. He used a wrench to firmly attach one end of the pipeline to the oil pump and the other end to the oil inlet of the cylinder block, then reinforced the pipeline connections with iron wire to prevent them from falling off while the tank was moving. Once the connection was complete, he applied another layer of sealant to the surface of the pipeline to enhance its sealing performance and cold resistance. The entire process took nearly an hour. During this time, the U.S. military lost another tank and several soldiers inside the assembly point. German tanks had advanced to the perimeter of the assembly point, less than 300 meters from where Sill was working. "Fill it with oil," Sill shouted to Wilson. Wilson immediately brought over the last 2 barrels of engine oil, carefully pouring them into the oil filler port of the engine compartment. Sill then jumped into the driver's cabin and tried to start the engine. Vroom, vroom. The engine emitted a low rumble, weaker than normal, but it ran nonetheless. Sill kept adjusting the throttle, watching the engine tachometer and oil pressure gauge. He saw that the oil pressure gradually stabilized, and no oil leaked from the bullet hole in the cylinder block. "It worked! Tank number 7 is operational!" Sill shouted excitedly, his voice hoarse. Just then, a German Tiger tank broke through the U.S. forward defensive line, heading straight for tank number 7 with its gun barrel already aimed. "Hurry! Start tank number 7 and move behind the bunker," Sill shouted, jumping into the co-driver's seat. Wilson quickly climbed into the turret, operating the whole machine gun to provide cover. The driver of tank number 7 immediately started the tank, heading toward the bunker inside the assembly point. The German Tiger tank fired immediately afterward, and the shell landed exactly where tank number 7 had been parked, kicking up a huge cloud of frozen soil. Sill glanced back at the Tiger tank, secretly grateful. If they had been a minute later, tank number 7 would have been completely destroyed, and all their repair work would have been in vain. There was no time to rest. Sill immediately rushed toward the other tank with a faulty gun, Sherman tank number 5. The tank's gun failed to fire, and after inspection, Sill discovered that the gun's firing mechanism had been damaged by shrapnel, preventing the firing pin from striking the artillery shell primer properly. The firing mechanism of the Sherman tank's 75mm gun consisted of a firing pin spring, trigger, and other components. Its structure was relatively precise, making it difficult to repair once damaged. Sill removed the firing mechanism and found that the firing pin spring was broken and the firing pin was bent and deformed. He was once again faced with a shortage of supplies. There were no spare firing mechanism parts in the repair materials. Sill frowned, his gaze falling on the German tank wreckage on the edge of the battlefield. He remembered the German tank parts Wilson had found earlier. Perhaps the firing mechanism, parts of German guns could be modified for use. He immediately said to the other mechanic, "Stay here and guard tank number 5. I'm going to the German tank wreckage area to look for firing mechanism parts." With that, he picked up his toolkit and ran quickly toward the German tank wreckage area, bending over to avoid detection. At this time, German infantry had infiltrated the edge of the assembly point, and Sill had to evade German patrols as he moved. He lay prone in the snow, watching several German infantrymen walk past him, not daring to breathe a word until they were gone, then continued moving toward the wreckage area. Upon reaching the German tank wreckage area, Sill quickly located a destroyed Panzer IV tank, climbing onto the turret and opening the gun compartment cover. The Panzer IV was equipped with a 75mm KWK-40 gun, whose firing mechanism bore a certain similarity to that of the Sherman's 75mm gun. Sill used a wrench to quickly remove the firing mechanism of the Panzer IV gun, taking out its firing pin spring and firing pin, then immediately returned to tank number 5. He performed simple grinding and modification on the German firing pin spring and firing pin to make them compatible with the firing mechanism of the Sherman tank's gun. This process was a test of his technical skill. The length and diameter of the firing pin had to be adjusted precisely. Otherwise, it would not fire the shells properly. Sill carefully filed the firing pin bit by bit, test-fitting it after each adjustment until it fit perfectly. After nearly 40 minutes of modification and installation, the firing mechanism of Tank No. 5's gun was finally repaired. Sill asked the gunner to test fire it. The gunner worked the breech, loaded a high-explosive shell, aimed at a cluster of German infantry in the distance, and pulled the trigger. Boom! With a loud roar, the shell hit the target accurately, mowing down a group of German infantrymen. The gunner shouted excitedly, "It worked! The gun is operational!" A relieved smile crossed Sill's face. This was the fourth tank he had repaired. At this point, the assembly point's defensive line was on the verge of collapse. U.S. soldiers had suffered over 50% casualties, and only 3 tanks remained fully operational. The 2 tanks Sill had just repaired undoubtedly injected a much-needed shot in the arm into the unit's morale. The last tank left to repair was Sherman Tank No. 9, whose turret-traversing mechanism had jammed, preventing it from adjusting the gun's firing direction. Stuck pointing in a fixed angle, it was rendered combat ineffective. Sill climbed onto the turret, opened the access panel of the traversing mechanism, and found that the gears of the mechanism were jammed by shrapnel, while the drive chain was also broken. He first used a wrench to clear the shrapnel jamming the gears, then inspected the damage to the drive chain. 3 links of the drive chain were completely broken and could no longer be used. Sill was once again stuck. There were no spare drive chains in the repair supplies, and it would be difficult to find compatible chains in the battlefield wreckage area. By this time, the sky had gradually darkened, and the temperature dropped to minus 20 degrees Celsius. The cold wind howled, cutting at their faces like knives. The German offensive had temporarily stopped, but everyone knew this was only a lull as the Germans prepared for an even more fierce attack. Sill sat on the turret, staring at the lights of the German positions in the distance, his mind racing to find a solution. Suddenly, he thought of the track links from the destroyed tanks. Their material and strength were similar to those of the drive chain, and perhaps they could be used to replace the broken sections of the drive chain. He immediately asked Wilson and the other mechanic to collect track links and connecting pins from the destroyed tanks. Working together, the 3 men collected 6 intact track links and several connecting pins from the wrecks of 3 destroyed Sherman tanks. Sill modified these track links, filing off the excess parts to make them fit the drive gears of the traversing mechanism. He then used the connecting pins to join the modified track links with the remaining drive chain, creating a new section of drive chain. Once the installation was complete, Sill turned the turret control lever. The turret began to rotate slowly. Although the rotation speed was slower than normal, it could now adjust the firing direction properly. By 21:30 on the evening of December the 17th, after 15 consecutive hours of intense repair work, Sill and his comrades had finally repaired all 5 damaged Sherman tanks on site. At this point, Sill was exhausted to the point of collapse. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands were stiff and purple from gripping tools for hours on end, and his military uniform was stained with oil, dust, and blood. But when he saw the 5 repaired tanks lined up neatly inside the assembly point, their engines emitting a low, powerful rumble, a sense of accomplishment filled his heart. The rebirth of these 5 tanks increased the detachment's operational tank count from 5 to 10, doubling their combat effectiveness. It is worth noting that Sill's successful repairs were due not only to his superb mechanical skills and unwavering willpower, but also to the Sherman tank's excellent maintainability and high interchangeability of parts. Designed with battlefield maintainability in mind from the start, the Sherman featured dedicated access panels for key components, such as the engine compartment and turret, allowing for quick disassembly and replacement of critical parts. Additionally, its components had a high degree of standardization. Parts from tanks produced in different batches were mostly interchangeable, and even parts from German tanks could be modified for use. This was particularly crucial in the supply-scarce battlefield environment. Furthermore, Sill's quick thinking and adaptability in using non-standard parts such as track links and German tank cooling pipes as substitutes were key to the success of the repair work. That night, the detachment commander convened an emergency combat meeting, deciding to use the tanks repaired by Sill to launch a counterattack against the German defensive line at dawn the next day, in an attempt to break through the German encirclement and rejoin the main force. During the meeting, the commander specifically praised Sill. Mechanic Sill has worked a miracle. What he repaired was not just 5 tanks, it was the hope of our unit. Without him, we would never have held on this long, let alone had a chance to counterattack. The soldiers also cast admiring glances at Sill, and the previously low morale was reignited by the rebirth of these 5 tanks. Sill did not stay for the second half of the meeting. He found a sheltered bunker, curled up inside, and fell asleep immediately. He was utterly exhausted. 15 consecutive hours of intense repair work, combined with the tension and fear of the day, had left him almost completely drained. But his sleep was restless, filled with the sounds of battlefield artillery and tank roars. He knew that the counterattack the next day would be a brutal battle. The Germans still held the advantage in manpower and equipment, and whether they could successfully break through the encirclement remained uncertain. But he also firmly believed that as long as these repaired tanks could play their role, and as long as his comrades fought together, they could work another miracle. At 3 a.m. on the morning of December 18th, Sill was woken up by Wilson. Wilson handed him a piece of hardtack and a canteen of hot water, saying, "Sill, it's time to get ready. The commander ordered us to launch the counterattack at 5 o'clock." Sill took the hardtack and hot water, ate a few mouthfuls quickly, then immediately got up to conduct the final pre-battle inspection of all 10 tanks. He checked the engine, tracks, guns, fuel, and oil status of each tank, ensuring that every tank was in optimal combat condition. He climbed onto one tank after another, opened access panel after access panel, tightened loose screws with a wrench, and wiped ice off the components with a rag. The cold wind still cut to the bone, but his heart was filled with strength. He knew that his work would directly affect the success of the counterattack and the lives of every comrade. At 4:30, the final pre-battle inspections of all tanks were completed. Sill jumped down from the tank, walked over to the detachment commander, saluted, and reported. "Reporting, Commander. All tanks have passed pre-battle inspection. They are in good condition and ready for combat at any time." The commander nodded, patted Sill on the shoulder, and said, "Well done, Sill. Now it's our turn." At this time, all the soldiers in the assembly point had manned their battle stations. The tank crews sat in the driver's cabins, ready to move out. The infantry assembled on both sides of the tanks, preparing to charge alongside the tanks. Above the battlefield, the stars dimmed and the cold wind howled. A counterattack that would determine the fate of the detachment was about to begin. Sill stood beside a tank, looking at his comrades in front of him, silently praying, "May this counterattack succeed, and may everyone survive this battlefield." At 5 a.m. on the morning of December 18th, a sharp bugle call suddenly echoed inside the assembly point. "Attack!" the detachment commander ordered. All 10 Sherman tanks started simultaneously, their engine roars shattering the silence of the battlefield. The tank tracks crushed the frozen soil and snow, making a creak-creak sound as they charged fiercely toward the German defensive line. Sill was assigned to the co-driver's seat of tank number 3, responsible for handling any mechanical failures that might occur to the tank during the battle and assisting the driver in observing the battlefield environment. For this counterattack, the commander adopted a tactic of armored cluster assault plus infantry coordinated cover. The 10 tanks were divided into 2 echelons. The first echelon of 5 tanks was responsible for breaking through the German defensive line head-on, using artillery and machine gun fire to suppress German fire points. The second echelon of 5 tanks would outflank from the sides, cutting off the German retreat route while covering the infantry's advance. Sill's tank number 3 belonged to the first echelon, charging at the forefront of the counterattack force. The Germans were clearly caught off guard by the U.S. counterattack at dawn, and their defensive line briefly descended into chaos. The first echelon of tanks seized the opportunity to advance rapidly, their guns continuously firing shells at German positions. Boom! 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 The 75mm guns of the Sherman tanks roared in turn, their shells accurately hitting German machine gun nests and anti-tank gun positions. blowing the German defensive fortifications to pieces. Under the suppression of U.S. artillery fire, German infantrymen fled into bunkers, unable to organize effective resistance. However, the Germans quickly recovered and began to organize a counterattack. German tanks emerged from their bunkers, launching an assault on the U.S. tank echelons, while German infantry used the cover of woods and gullies to attack U.S. infantry units. A brutal tank battle erupted. Sitting inside tank number 3, Sill could clearly feel the violent shaking of the tank when it was hit by shells. He gripped the handrails inside the tank tightly, his eyes fixed on the engine dashboard, constantly monitoring the tank's mechanical status. "German Panzer IV spotted on the left, 800 meters away," the gunner shouted loudly. The driver immediately adjusted direction, turning the tank's front toward the German Panzer IV. The gunner aimed quickly, pulled the trigger, and an armor-piercing shell roared out, hitting the side armor of the German Panzer IV accurately. "Target hit," the gunner shouted excitedly. Black smoke billowed from the German Panzer IV, which ground to a halt. The crew was forced to abandon the vehicle and escape, but as soon as they jumped out of the tank, they were killed by U.S. infantry fire. Just then, Sill suddenly noticed that the engine speed of tank number 3 was fluctuating and the oil pressure was continuously dropping. He immediately said to the driver, "The engine might be having problems. Watch your speed. I'm going down to check." The driver nodded, driving the tank to the cover of a relatively safe bunker. Sill opened the hatch, jumped out quickly, and braved German artillery fire to immediately open the engine compartment cover for inspection. After checking, he found that the fuel line he had repaired earlier had loosened due to the violent shaking, causing insufficient fuel supply and thus affecting the engine's operation. Sill immediately grabbed a wrench, quickly tightened the connection of the fuel line, and reinforced it with iron wire. At this moment, a German shell landed less than 5 meters away, and the powerful shock wave knocked him to the ground. He struggled to his feet, his face and hands covered in dirt. But he had no time to tend to himself, continuing to tighten the pipeline. In just 3 minutes, he completed the repair work. "Okay, we can move forward again." Sill jumped back onto the tank and shouted to the driver. Tank number 3 started again, rejoining the counterattack force. The situation on the battlefield grew increasingly intense, with tanks from both sides engaging in close quarters, fighting to the death. Although the U.S. Sherman tanks were slightly inferior to the German Tiger tanks in armor and firepower, they held an advantage in numbers, and the soldiers fought with high morale. The 5 tanks repaired by Sill played a key role in the battle, working in tandem with the original 5 operational tanks to form a powerful fire net, continuously suppressing German tanks and infantry. With the flanking maneuver of the second echelon, gaps began to appear in the German defensive line. U.S. infantry seized the opportunity to advance rapidly, eliminating several German fire points and clearing the way for the tank's advance. Sill's first echelon took the chance to break through the German frontline defensive line, advancing toward the depth of the German positions. During the advance, they encountered a German tank platoon, and a fierce artillery duel broke out between the two sides. The 5 U.S. tanks opened fire on the Germans simultaneously, with a dense hail of shells surrounding the German tanks. After 10 minutes of fierce fighting, 3 German Panzer IV tanks were destroyed, and the remaining 2 fled in disarray. At this time, Sill learned via radio that the second echelon had successfully cut off the German retreat route, encircling a German infantry company. The commander ordered the first echelon to quickly reinforce the second echelon and eliminate the encircled Germans. Tank number 3 immediately changed direction, heading toward the second echelon's position. On the way to reinforce, they encountered a German Tiger tank. The Tiger's 88mm gun was extremely powerful, destroying 1 U.S. Sherman tank with a single shot. The soldiers fell into a panic, and their advance slowed significantly. "Don't panic. The Tiger's side armor is relatively weak. We'll attack from the flank," the commander shouted over the radio. Sill's tank number 3 and 2 other Sherman tanks immediately adjusted their direction, outflanking the Tiger tank from the side. The Tiger crew spotted the U.S. maneuver and immediately rotated the turret to respond. But due to the Tiger's slow turret traverse speed, by the time it was aimed, the 3 U.S. tanks had already completed their targeting. "Fire!" With a shout from the gunner, 3 armor-piercing shells hit the side armor of the Tiger tank simultaneously. The Tiger's armor was pierced, and the engine compartment erupted in flames, quickly rendering it combat ineffective. After dealing with the Tiger tank, tank number 3 rushed to the second echelon's position, joining the battle to eliminate the encircled Germans. Although the encircled German infantry resisted tenaciously, they suffered heavy casualties under the combined attack of U.S. tanks and infantry. After half an hour of fierce fighting, the encircled German infantry company was completely eliminated. The U.S. military killed over 120 German soldiers, captured more than 30, and seized a large quantity of weapons, ammunition, and supplies. This counterattack was a major victory for the U.S. military. The 5 tanks repaired by SIL played a key role in the battle, destroying 8 German tanks, 12 anti-tank guns, and over 20 machine gun nests, laying a solid foundation for the success of the counterattack. The German offensive was severely checked, forcing them to contract their defensive line and abandon their encirclement of the U.S. assembly point. SIL's detachment successfully broke through the German encirclement, establishing contact with the main force. It is worth adding that the success of this counterattack was due not only to the improved combat effectiveness brought by the tanks repaired by SIL, but also to the tenacious fighting spirit of the U.S. soldiers and the correct tactical command of the commander. Additionally, U.S. air support played a supporting role. Several P-47 fighter planes arrived later in the battle, bombing and strafing German positions, further suppressing German firepower. On the German side, after hours of continuous attacks, the soldiers were exhausted and supplies were running short, significantly reducing their combat effectiveness. This was also an important reason for their defeat in this counterattack. At 10 o'clock on the morning of December 18th, SIL's detachment rejoined the main force. After learning of SIL's feat of repairing 5 tanks in a desperate situation, the commander of the main force highly praised him. Mechanic SIL's actions are a miracle on the battlefield. With his own hands, he restored combat power to the unit and won the opportunity for victory. SIL's story quickly spread throughout the entire 4th Armored Division, and the soldiers hailed him as the creator of tank rebirth. After rejoining the main force, the detachment did not rest for long before receiving a new mission: to continue advancing toward Bastogne, assist the main force in breaking through the German encirclement, and deliver supplies to the besieged 101st Airborne Division. SIL once again threw himself into intense work, working with other mechanics to conduct a comprehensive inspection and maintenance of all tanks, replacing damaged parts, and refueling and replenishing oil. He knew that the upcoming mission would still be arduous. The Germans had deployed large numbers of troops and equipment along the road to Bastogne, and a new brutal battle was imminent. In the early morning of December 19, SIL's detachment followed the main force, launching an attack toward Bastogne. For this offensive, the U.S. military deployed a large number of tanks and infantry with overwhelming firepower. The 5 tanks repaired by SIL remained the mainstay of the attack, continuously breaking through German defensive lines and destroying German fire points in the battle. SIL sat inside tank number 3, constantly monitoring the tank's mechanical status and handling various malfunctions promptly. During one battle, the track of tank number 7 was hit by a German rocket launcher and broken. SIL immediately jumped out of the tank and, under the cover of his comrades, quickly repaired the track. After 20 minutes of repair work, tank number 7 was restored to combat effectiveness, rejoining the battle once again. Under the powerful offensive of the U.S. military, the German defensive line was continuously breached. On December 23rd, SIL's 4th Armored Division successfully broke through the last German defensive line, reaching the outskirts of Bastogne and establishing contact with the besieged 101st Airborne Division. Subsequently, U.S. troops continuously delivered supplies and reinforcements to Bastogne, and the 101st Airborne Division, besieged for days, finally got a much-needed respite. The 5 tanks repaired by SIL participated in 12 battles during the mission to reinforce Bastogne, destroying 15 German tanks and 20 anti-tank guns, making an important contribution to the success of the reinforcement mission. With the continuous arrival of U.S. reinforcements, the tide of the battle in the Ardennes began to turn. The Allies launched a fierce offensive against the German counterattack forces from the north and south, cutting off their supply lines and encircling several German units. Trapped in a desperate situation, the German counterattack forces had to retreat to the German homeland. Sill's detachment followed the main force, continuing to advance toward the German homeland and participating in numerous battles. During these battles, Sill remained steadfast in his post, constantly repairing damaged tanks and providing strong support for the unit's advance. On January 25, 1945, the Battle of the Bulge officially came to an end. In this campaign, the Germans suffered heavy losses, with approximately 100,000 casualties and prisoners, losing about 700 tanks and self-propelled guns and around 1,600 artillery pieces. The U.S. military also paid a heavy price, with approximately 81,000 casualties and 730 tanks and self-propelled guns lost. The Battle of the Bulge was the last large-scale campaign on the European battlefield during World War II. It completely shattered Hitler's last hope of turning the tide of the war and accelerated the demise of Nazi Germany. In this campaign, Sill's repair miracle was recorded in the combat history of the 4th Armored Division, becoming a model of battlefield mechanical support. After the end of the campaign, Sill was awarded the Silver Star for his outstanding performance in the battle. The citation read, "Gil E. Sill, in the desperate situation of the Battle of the Bulge, relying on his superb mechanical repair skills and unwavering willpower, repaired 5 damaged tanks, making an indelible contribution to restoring the unit's combat effectiveness and achieving a crucial victory." His actions embody the courage and dedication of the U.S. military personnel. When Sill received the medal, he simply said calmly, "I only did what I was supposed to do. The real heroes are the comrades who sacrificed their lives on the battlefield." In the subsequent battles, Sill continued to follow the 4th Armored Division, participating in many battles advancing toward the German homeland and repairing more damaged tanks. His repair skills became more and more exquisite, making him one of the most outstanding mechanics recognized by the 4th Armored Division. After the end of the war, Sill retired and returned to the United States, resuming a peaceful life. But the repair miracle he created in the Battle of the Bulge is forever etched in military history, becoming a spiritual force that inspires future generations. On January 25, 1945, with the last German counterattack force withdrawing to the German homeland, the Battle of the Bulge officially drew to a close. This brutal campaign that lasted 6 weeks was not only the last large-scale strategic counteroffensive on the European battlefield of World War II, but also a decisive turning point in the balance of power between the Allies and Nazi Germany. The U.S. military's ability to reverse the situation from the initial passive position of being attacked was not the result of a single factor, but the inevitable combination of multiple forces such as strategic adjustments, tactical coordination, logistical support, and soldiers' willpower. And Mechanic Sill's tank repair work was a highly representative key link in this complex system. From a strategic perspective, the rapid response and coordinated deployment of the Allied High Command were the core prerequisites for reversing the war situation. Although the German Operation Watch on the Rhine initially gained an advantage through surprise attacks, after realizing the seriousness of the war situation, the Allies quickly integrated the forces of the Northern and Southern fronts. General Patton's Third Army urgently changed direction, launching a counterattack from the Southern Front toward the Ardennes region. General Montgomery's 21st Army Group stabilized the defensive line on the Northern Front, cutting off the German northward advance channel. This cross-theater rapid coordination effectively curbed the German advance momentum, buying breathing time for the besieged units. As the core force of the Southern Front counterattack, the 4th Armored Division, to which Sill belonged, its recovery of combat effectiveness directly affected the progress of the mission to reinforce Bastogne. The 5 tanks repaired by Sill continued to play a role in the process of breaking through the German defensive line on the Southern Front, becoming an important tactical support for the implementation of the strategic deployment. From a tactical analysis, the U.S. military's tactical system of tank cluster plus infantry coordination plus air support showed strong adaptability in the subsequent battles, and the effective operation of this system was inseparable from the guarantee of equipment combat effectiveness. The 5 Sherman tanks repaired by Sill doubled the tank combat effectiveness of the detachment, not only breaking the German encirclement in the breakout battle, but also undertaking the assault task in many battles to reinforce Bastogne. It is worth noting that Sill's emergency modification ability demonstrated in the repair work was an important embodiment of tactical flexibility, using German tank parts, track links, and other non-standard accessories to repair equipment. This battlefield local sourcing maintenance mode allowed the U.S. military to maintain the continuous combat capability of equipment in the predicament of material shortage, making up for the gap between U.S. tanks and German Tiger and Panther tanks in armor and firepower. Sill's repair work further highlighted the strategic value of logistical mechanical support in modern warfare. In traditional cognition, battlefield victories are often attributed to frontline charging soldiers and commanding commanders. But the practice of the Battle of the Bulge proved that mechanical support is the lifeline for maintaining the unit's combat effectiveness. In the early stage of the campaign, due to frequent tank failures and shortage of maintenance materials, many U.S. military units fell into a passive position in the German surprise attack. The reason why Sill's detachment was able to break through the encirclement was that he transformed damaged equipment into combat power through precise repairs. According to the post-war combat history of the 4th Armored Division, during the campaign, the division's mechanical unit repaired more than 300 damaged tanks. These reborn tanks destroyed a total of more than 200 German armored targets, directly promoting the progress of the Southern Front counterattack. Sill's personal deeds are the most vivid microcosm of this large-scale support system. With his 15-hour continuous repair persistence, he interpreted the modern warfare concept of logistics is combat effectiveness. From the perspective of the historical influence of the campaign, the Battle of the Bulge completely shattered Hitler's last hope of turning the tide of the war. The Germans exhausted their last elite armored units and strategic reserves in this campaign and were no longer able to organize large-scale counterattacks. The Allies thus accelerated the process of advancing toward the German homeland, laying the foundation for the surrender of Nazi Germany in May 1945. At the same time, this campaign also provided an important reference for the construction of the logistical support system in modern warfare. The problems exposed in the campaign, such as equipment maintenance standardization and emergency support mobility, promoted the reform of the logistical support system of various countries' armies after the war. The regular deployment of mechanical maintenance forces and the establishment of cross-service support coordination mechanisms can all find their origins in the experience of the Battle of the Bulge. Looking back at Sill's desperate repair work in the Ardennes forest, its significance has long exceeded the specific achievement of repairing 5 tanks. Under the multiple pressures of -20 degrees Celsius cold, intensive artillery attacks, and extreme shortage of materials, what he showed was not only superb repair skills, but also the tenacious will of ordinary soldiers to stick to their missions in desperate situations. This will was not an isolated case, but a concentrated embodiment of the collective spirit of the Allied soldiers. From the 101st Airborne Division that held on to Bastogne waiting for reinforcements, to the infantry of the 4th Armored Division that advanced under artillery fire, and to mechanics like Sill who silently repaired tanks in the rear, it was the persistence and coordination of countless people that ultimately forged the victory of the campaign. Today, the smoke of the Battle of the Bulge has long dissipated, but the tank rebirth miracle created by Sill still has profound practical significance. It reminds us that the outcome of a war is never a single-dimensional contest, and every post and every persistence may become a key force affecting the war situation. In today's era, when modern warfare is transforming into informatization and intelligence, the connotation of mechanical support has expanded into a broader equipment as support system, but the never give up, dare to innovate spirit upheld by Sill is still an indispensable spiritual core in the construction of military combat effectiveness, inspiring future generations to stick to their missions and break through desperate situations in the face of various difficulties and obstacles. From a macro-historical perspective, the Battle of the Bulge was an important node in the victory process of the anti-fascist war, and Sill's personal experience was the most vivid footnote in the grand historical narrative. It allows us to see that great victories are never abstract concepts, but are gathered by countless specific and ordinary persistence and dedication. This is perhaps the reason why Sill's repair miracle can transcend time and space and be forever remembered. It is not only a tactical highlight of a campaign, but also a spiritual symbol of humanity, sticking to justice and never giving up in the face of evil and difficulties. Well, that's the story of Mechanic Sill and the tank rebirth in the Battle of the Bulge for today. In the cruel war, it's not only the heroes who charge forward that are worthy of being remembered. Ordinary people like Sill, who guard combat effectiveness with their hands in the rear, also wrote their own legends. If you like this World War II historical story, don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. And you can also talk about the most impressive World War II small character story in your heart in the comment area. See you in the next video. Bye.